I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go.
Hello and welcome to an episode of the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 224, and today we're in the midst of a curriculum series, and I want to encourage people to think creatively about what books kind of have brought you joy, or what books out there are exciting or interesting to your kids that connect to current events, that are kind of a blend of all of those things. And so some of the time I'm kind of giving ideas for how you might bring all of those things together, or step by step how you might go ahead and do those things. And sometimes I think as we do as educators, we want to model what the possibilities could be. And so today's episode is kind of a modeling of what was happening in my brain as I was engaging in some fun reading for myself. It's a good thing to engage in fun reading when we're always learning and growing professionally. Fun to just get out of that and sometimes do things for fun. So I was reading book 2 in the House on the Cerulean Sea series. So this is called Somewhere Beyond the Sea. I really enjoyed the first one. I listened to the audiobook version as I was marathon training a year and a half ago or so, and really, really liked it. Particularly the narration of the audiobook I thought was excellent. And I just think TJ Klune's writing in the series particularly, I mean, this was all that I had read at this particular moment in time. And then since I've read some other of his stuff, but it's so well done. And he really just hooked me in the forward. And so let's just kind of dive in. I'm going to read the forward to you. I'll give you the gist without spoilers. And then I'm going to talk about what is happening in my brain as I'm thinking about constructing a unit around this, like where my brain goes. And then I also want to help us think whether you are a teacher or an instructional leader who might be supporting teachers to design curriculum and bring out the joy and the kind of creative activism and possibilities that are present. And like, how do we tie, for example, I think this is kind of the crux of this episode for me, is like how we tie kind of a radical imagining, as a phrase I learned from Adrienne Marie Brown, and the kind of activism or civics component of all the things that I love, and I think many of us love to do, we talk a lot about on the podcast, with something like an ELA course, right? Like a curriculum where you should have a book and you have to do these reading comprehension things and you have to do all of these reading and writing skills, right? Like, how do we kind of merge all of that together? I often talk a lot about social studies, and I think civics is just naturally a component of social studies, but it's so possible to do this well in ELA that I wanted to kind of think that through just as another example. So here we go. Somewhere Beyond the Sea. Here is the foreword by the author, TJ Klune. For the trans community the world over, I see you, I hear you, I love you. This story is for you. And the book continues on to be, as some reviews have called it, very heavy-handed in its connections to, I mean, I'm recording this in 2025, amidst a second Trump presidency where attacks on trans people legislatively, in social society, on social media, right, in conversation amongst politicians is just tragic and harmful and scary and frustrating and anger-inducing and all the things. And so I think the original kind of new teacher in me, or not even new teacher, but just like when I was a teacher, the way I would design curriculum would be around, okay, here's this terrible thing that's happening in the world and current events and politics. We're going to kind of learn about it. We're going to get frustrated by it. And then we're going to maybe do an activism project like in a future unit, or we might talk about how it makes us feel, and then we kind of like leave it. And I've just been learning a lot as a human, but also from these professional learning books and things, that it's really important to do something with that, right? Research shows this, but also I was just reading a book by Chad Dumas, who I will be interviewing on the podcast. I think at the time this will air out, you can go back and it will be a July episode, so it'll have already aired. But in it, he quotes Paulo Freire, who actually, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the text in front of me, but something like people who just, have dialogue, um, like they leave frustrated if there's just dialogue and there's not action as a consequence of the dialogue. And so I want to keep connecting back to that civics idea of like, yes, we're dialoguing and dialogue is great. And I'm talking a lot about student-led discussion this year, particularly. But really, apologies for all the dog noises. I have a puppy and woo, sometimes we hear a lot of collar shaking. So collar is off now. Let's see how this goes. We can, right, fuse all of these things. We can do this well. Here we go. Let's dive in. Totally forgot where I was. Here's the gist of this book. The series is about magical kids who live on a remote island. They are awesome, and the audiobook version really gives them excellent voices. It's incredible. So I highly recommend once more the audiobook version. And the larger community has really fear-mongered and oppressed magical beings in this series, this book and the book before it. And so this story explores the adults that run the orphanage. I don't want to spoiler anything from the previous book either, so I'll just say his treatment as a child and his public statements about himself, his kids, and magical beings in general are all kind of part of this particular book, more so even than in the first book, although the first book touches on these things. So I do think that you could teach this as a standalone. It's also nice as a series. I think you could get at a lot of the elements from the first book without the second book. However, I will say, as I indicated, the reviews language talks about earlier, there's a very heavy-handed connection to current events and people who are different, particularly queer folks. But I think honestly, like the connections are quite broad and applicable. I mean, magical creatures being kind of the focus of this book, I think would say, right, this is not something that we have in our world, however, can be parallel to many things happening. So themes of the book that you could explore in this text and connect through discussion, connect if you were doing this as kind of literature circles, and this is one of the options, and connecting to other books, however you want to bring themes in. One is found family. And so connecting experience for kids who have moved to maybe a new family, or they have moved to a new school, right? So kids who maybe have been in foster care, military families who move a lot, just people who have, their parents have changed jobs and they need to, or their caretakers have changed jobs, I should say, and they need to attend a new school now. So found family and kind of those are options for connections to the human piece of who students are and how they're showing up in the class and what they might be able to bring in as personal experience if you're doing, for example, a circle share to connect to the book. Radical imagining, again, a term I referenced, I learned from Adrienne Marie Brown. And here's how she kind of talks about it and she cites, I apologize for the pronunciation of these names, but Kasnabish and Haven, 2014, who define it as ability to imagine the world, life, and social institutions not as they are, but as they might otherwise be. It brings possible futures back to work on the present to inspire action. So this idea of radical imagining happens in this fantasy book. It happens in any fantasy book, really, but really well done here. And then, connecting that to current events, there's a beautiful opportunity through dialogue and through project-based learning here, I think. Also themes of the book, power of voice and allyship. So there's a very human focus of this book, very, very much humanity is central. And, they recognize the importance of stories. They recognize that the main character talks to the media, talks to people, brings people's humanity out in understanding his story and connecting with the pain and the radical imagining of this person, right? And I think that humanity that is central is really important for us as humans to recognize, and students as they're learning to have civic dialogue and kind of speak in different ways than they see in popular news coverage of politicians, right? This is kind of a way to paint that picture and keep humanity at the center. And I say allyship very intentionally as well, because there are people who in this book are not magical and they are rallying around the magical community. Of course, there are those who also are not, but there is, I think, a good attention to that aspect of the book as well, that you don't need to be part of a community to kind of let them lead and support them in ways they want to be supported, right? And so there's this true kind of allyship happening there, or co-conspiratorness happening there. Also themes, queer representation, as I mentioned earlier, and those current event connections are really clear. So I think, again, if you want to do anything really intentionally with LGBTQ plus or queer current events, like, I mean, to merge both of those, or just like as part of, like Pride Month, or as part of, I mean, I like going beyond the months, but as part of kind of a unit on queer studies, queer history, queer texts and literature, or again, as a current events connection, where if you're doing this as, a crossover unit with a social studies team, or you are a humanities teacher that kind of teaches both, I think there's very clear connections that you can pull up. Now, how I might teach it, I've kind of touched on this a little bit so far, but I might say, okay, so the unit topic, like I'm teaching a unit on activism, and radical imagining becomes an activist strategy option. So I'm reading this book through the lens of it being a piece of activism or a piece of civic engagement. And so I'm actually reading it for the strategy itself of like, this author is radically imagining what life could look like through this kind of fantastical parallel world. So that could be an option. I also could do a creative writing unit if I'm an ELA teacher and I am pulling writing instruction ideas from, I would really like, I've mentioned this before on the podcast, that we got to actually interview the authors, which was so cool. Their stories, their voices. And so pulling ideas from like, how do we use mentor texts to study them, to learn what they do well, and then do it in our own writing. I think that would be super, super cool, both from like kind of a fantasy element, but also just from like a good writing element, and how to kind of weave in current events and all the things. Now, another option for kind of thinking through how I would pace out the unit and kind of the lesson by lesson level of what I could do. So unit arc wise, I could have a class circle on personal stories around identity, oppression, and or activism or radical imagining, right? So I could say, okay, you can bring in kind of your personal connections to the humanity of these characters. So either you've had a similar experience, you have identified with the non-magical beings and their allyship of an oppressed group, you have had this opportunity to share kind of your human story or your lived experience around an issue, and we're heard or we're not heard, and what did that feel like? You have a vision of what the world could look like other than what it currently is. Like, tell us about it. So, I mean, you could connect to characters, you could connect to the author and their arts. I think there's a lot of things you could do here, but I always love the idea of starting with a class circle and lived experience and creative ideas and kind of surfacing those and grounding the unit in that.
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share the free resource for this episode. It is the Curriculum Playlist by Lindsay Lyons. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/224. Now back to the show.
You could, I mentioned this earlier, but read the book whole class, or read the book as a small group and kind of do literature circles. So again, all those themes, I like to do literature circles that come together around certain themes or have multiple common themes. I've listed those out. So you could certainly run literature circles knowing, without reading the book, you can know kind of how this might sit among some of the other books you may choose or offer students to choose from. You can, this is a concept actually from Their Stories, Their Voices. You could tell I absolutely loved that text. Thank you, authors. You could read it as a reader and a writer. So you could read the text for the story itself as you would typically read a fictional story, but you could also read it through the lens of a writer. So either we read the whole book through as a reader, experience the whole thing, and then go back and kind of pick out what we loved. Or I love the idea of doing, and I think this is Jeff, oh, I always forget his name, Anderson, I think, Mechanically Inclined is his book. And he talks about kind of keeping a writer's notebook and identifying some, interesting phrases or interesting things that writers do as you're reading. And then you can kind of talk about that within the literature circle, within the whole class share out. You could do, I used to do like a Friday. Every Friday, the lesson was something like a writer's notebook, or kind of pulling out these interesting writing techniques that we would surface from the literature circles as we were reading. This could be part of individual student journals where they submit a journal every week in response to whatever book they're reading. So if they're reading this, they could kind of highlight what it is that the author is doing based on however much they read that week. Okay, those are all examples. Literature circle activities, if you are doing this in a literature circle, you could prompt the student discussions by inviting connections. So I always really like this idea to just invite connections. And so you might say, like, connect to a personal lived experience and share that with a group. You might connect to a current event story. And you know, that changes week to week. So students could bring up something one week, and then 3 weeks later, there's a brand new current event that they could connect to. So lots of opportunities. You could connect to another class. You could connect to a lot of different things, another book that you had read earlier in the year or last year. You could use a protocol like Think, Talk, Open Exchange from Rhonda Bondi, where you're inviting each individual student to kind of, or everyone, I guess, has think time, but each individual student has a moment to think before they individually speak. They speak. All people get to go do that. So, you know, I have 5 seconds to think, 30 seconds to talk, and then the next person has 5 seconds to think about their idea in silence, 30 seconds to talk, right? All around the circle, and then we open exchange. So it's kind of an open dialogue, no kind of boundaries. You can use another protocol like color, symbol, image, which comes from Harvard's Project Zero Thinking Routines, where you're inviting metaphorical thinking. I love this in a lot of ways, but I particularly love it when we're thinking about good writing techniques and abstract ways of thinking. And so, yes, you're reading this fiction, fantastical novel, and we're abstracting ways that this actually connects to our lived experience in the real world and current events. Like, that requires a level of abstraction that I think sometimes the color, symbol, image routine or others like it can make a little bit easier. It's a nice scaffold. And as an additional scaffold for this type of thinking, I like climber cards, which we can link to in the show notes and the blog post for this episode, because those are these cool kind of like deck of cards where there's images on them that you don't have to like come up with the images, but you could also Google search for some images or have students bring up images on their computers or devices if you have that available. Okay, other things within the unit arc. I think I would do a current event day for this particular book. And I mean, you could all discuss the same one. Like, you could name it or have a student name it and bring it in, and everyone explores it and connects it to the book. Or students could research their own, and then either in some groups or kind of individually turn and talk, or however you want to structure it, students could say, hey, I've been reading this. I've found this current event. I'm bringing it in. I'm going to summarize it for my partner or the group or the class. You could do a gallery walk. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to share out here, but they're the ones doing that original research and they're bringing it in. So 2 different options there. I think at some point I would do a Socratic seminar specifically on linking the book to current events, because it is so heavy-handed, because it's offering itself up to that, and because current events are always changing. It'll be interesting, you know, if you were reading this several years from its publication date, how does the current world at that time connect to the time of publication and what was happening in the world, particularly considering the United States context of the author and that all that element. But I think it'd be really interesting to do a specific Socratic seminar on that. We can also link to the Socratic seminar template in the blog post that I've used with students. A true collaborative effort from many of the students across many teachers, mostly in the social studies department of Manhattan International High School, as well as the different networks that we have been involved in, International's Network for Public Schools and the New York Performance Standards Consortium. So thank you all to those of you who have contributed to that. And some discussion prompts that I would use within that Socratic seminar would be something like, what's the formula for effective activism or effective civic engagement, or, you know, eradicating oppression, whatever? What's the ideal balance of shared identity spaces and inclusion? So this idea of like affinity spaces and having this preserved space where, you know, you can be with people who share an identity that is in really oppressive spaces unwelcomed, right? And like wanting that inclusive, potentially healing space for allies and people who are identifying in these affinity spaces to really come together and heal together. Like, what is that ideal balance, and who gets to decide that, right? That could be really interesting to explore. What would it look like if everyone was able to thrive? Right? You could probably, if you're familiar with my podcast and my resources in the past, you could tell I'm using some of these sentence starters that I often share. So feel free to use the beginning of any of these sentences as well and kind of make your own ending, or create, of course, something completely different. Here's another one. What would it look like if communities interrupted harm every time it happened? Right. So again, that radical imagining, like, let's imagine that was really awesome. What would that actually look like? And so you can kind of name a really awesome element of society or community and say, hey, what would that look like? Or what would it take to get there? Right. And here's, I think, probably my favorite how do you imagine a thriving fantasy or literary community? And so I think that one really sets us up nicely to brainstorm collectively some ideas as a group. And this could be a Socratic seminar in smaller groups too. It could be like your literature circle groups or something. It doesn't have to be a whole class, because what I envision being the project for a unit like that would be that students then write their own kind of fantasy or literary piece, short story or something, and they could do it collaboratively, small group, whole class could do like an anthology, right? And kind of like do something together, or it could be just like a purely individual endeavor. I think that's fine. But I love the idea of like, we're going to study this kind of radical imagining activist strategy as fantasy book connected to current events, and you get to do your own after the study and reading of this one. So I think that could be a super cool unit. And then I also want to name just the writing workshop process being really integral to something like that. So using all of those ideas from their stories, their voices, super cool. I think I would totally love to play with that idea. If someone does this, please let me know. I'd be really excited to hear how that goes and learn from you. And also thinking about, of course, it's always on my mind now, Dr. Asao Inoi's work on dimension-based rubrics and dimension-based assessment to really make sure that we are getting a peer response, not just the teacher's response. So the peers and you as the educator would be sharing, what was your reader experience of the student's writing and giving that feedback. So again, there's that interplay. Like, it's not just this one particular standard we are measuring on, and that's what you get feedback on. It's actually the interplay of what I wrote down and how people are reading and experiencing that writing and what they're thinking about, what connections they're drawing, is actually kind of the beauty of the piece of writing, specifically when we're talking about current events and oppression and radical imagining and activism and making the world and community a better place that we all are living in. I think this is such a beautiful opportunity to leverage an equitable assessment protocol like that. So that is the episode. We are going to link to the freebie for this episode in the blog post. That's going to be our curriculum playlist. So a ton of different things there for you. That is going to be located at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/224. Until next time.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.